Maybe just to start to say congratulations on the show. It's really incredible. I think thank you. I was here yesterday, but I was here again today and had the chance to spend a couple of hours here. I think one of the things that's been really surprising to me is what a joyful show it is, actually. And I think in a way, like reading about it and anticipating it, and even seeing some of the works in excerpt form before, and knowing the subject matter and knowing the political context, especially at the moment, I was kind of braced in a way for a show that was going to be much more somber. And I think and I think maybe particularly this piece we're going to start with, the tone is really surprisingly joyful, or at least is optimistic. I don't know if that's does that reflect your feeling of the show also?
Do you wanna?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I don't know if that's the kind of thing that comes to mind necessarily, but I feel that, so much of how we've been thinking about sort of these difficult conditions is to sort of think of, we always say that think of a break as an opening, or think of something that is meant to be broken, or a fragment as something that is something generative. So how do you see something that is broken not as just broken, but as something that you can generate new possibilities from? Possibilities of living, but possibilities, and then literally, the fragment. How does the fragment and repetition become something generative just by merely repeating it? So a lot of the gestures you see in the work are samples of movements, of fragments that are then repeated. And a lot of practices from our part of the world, such as Sufi practices, are all based on repetition. And so that's something that's carried on in our work for a long time. How do we not just linger in something that is broken? But, I'm just repeating myself at this point.
I think that, the basis of this work, are really, it's people's practices. So we began this project by basically collecting online videos of people in Syria and Iraq and Palestine, and a bit from Yemen too. Just ordinary people singing and dancing, really, we were very drawn to this material, and it became, after a while, very evident to us that actually this was a very critical form of testimony that was happening. So in a way, the oral sort of history of what is happening in these places is happening through people's song and dance. And there is a lot of pain and trauma, but there is also an insistence on life itself. And I think that's very important. That's where the joy comes in, because what we're interested in is how people, how they don't simply survive those moments, but how they generate, even momentarily, different possibilities of living and being, and insisting on a sense of self, insisting on a sense of community, insisting on a sense of place, even in a situation where an entire living fabric is being destroyed. So it's very important for us to, also think about how, we can amplify that will to life and that insistence on life that is there's a lot of tension in it, because there's a lot of difficulty and pain. But it's not just that. I mean, people resist conditions because they want to live in a different way in the world. That's what resistance is about. It's a story of love, actually. So I think that's a very important aspect of our work.
Yeah.
And I think it comes out very clearly in this particular project.
Absolutely, and we should give the title of the piece. And the reason I'm sitting with the dropping the
titles
is because the title is so long. So I'm going to read it. May amnesia never kiss us on the mouth, only sounds that tremble through us. And I think I'd love to come back to the idea about fragments also later. And I think it's important that you point to the way in which the show is very porous. Like there are these ways in which elements, phrases, motifs from one work. So although it looks kind of neatly divided on the page here that there are these 5 works, in reality it feels much more fluid when you're in the show. But maybe we could just hear a bit more about some of the kind of specific elements of this piece, which, like you said, the starting point was this kind of found footage of people dancing, but there's also footage that you've shot, and kind of dance and music that you've commissioned or found. Can you talk more about these different components and different collaborators for the piece?
Well, actually, the sound, we made the sound, but what you want to begin? And, or I can.
Yeah, I mean, I think the process. The process was a kind of very long process, and the fragment and sampling was like something that me and Ruanne have been working on for like a very long time. It's actually what kind of brought us together in terms of our practice. And with this work, we had this collection of videos. Like Ruanne said, we actually were drawn to the material, but we didn't actually know why. We were just really collecting it and drawn to it and really being obsessive over it. And this started about 10 years ago, so it was like a really long time of us just collecting videos and making this like pseudo archive on our desktops and like problematizing it and like, what does it mean to archive, and kind of just like this sort of this conversation, but not with the goal of making a work or anything, just sort of discussing and thinking about these things. And then when it dawned on us that this was the way that communities were holding on to themselves, it became sort of more evident of sort of what we can do here and how we can, because we're interested in people's practices and how we can push them forward, how we can take them into existing people's practices. So the process of our filming later and then the sound composition was we worked with 3 musicians and a dancer in Palestine. We spent almost 3 years with each of them separately first, discussing these, looking at material and discussing the ideas and what we were thinking about, and then sampling that material. And I think it's important that they were musicians and not professional dancers. One of them is a professional dancer, and they're musicians that usually work with electronic music and equipment. So they very much understand the idea of sampling, but they're not vocalists and instrument playing necessarily, and they've never really used their bodies in this way. So we basically asked them to use their body as the sampler, and they understood that instantly. And so it was like a whole process of us looking at material, fragmenting it, thinking, and then them sort of embodying these fragments and what it meant to them. And there was like a big sort of, they had to trust us. So there was like because they were put in vulnerable states. We weren't asking them to just come and like, these are the moves, do them. Like they had to really embody it and live it. And
they weren't necessarily performers in that way naturally.
No,
not at all. And so they have their own personas as musicians and they're known. And so they kind of had to sort of step out of that, and they really trusted us in order, there was a long process of this building of trust essentially. And, we started with more musicians actually, and that never continued because it just wasn't the thing for them. They just couldn't do it. And there were many days where we would stop filming because it was really difficult, because it was a real embodied experience.
But also because some of the material, the archive itself, some of it is difficult material, that you're thinking through and working with. And it had a lot of, very deep resonance for the performers. I mean, the the songs that were being sung in Iraq definitely resonated with them. So it had a lot of layers making
And then they
performances.
started to sample each other as well. So it was kind of like we spent years filming individually with them, and then we started showing. They didn't know what the other. They know each other very well, but they don't. They weren't like, we asked them not to discuss the stuff together, so that we kind of, and then we brought them together. They started looking at the other's material and like sort of repeating, sampling themselves, like others, and then we brought them together for a group performance, and then actually the dancer was brought more towards the end, and she sampled their moves as well. So there was like a lot of interpretation, reinterpretation, resampling of stuff, and I guess that was.
I think we were also we were thinking a lot about how these songs travel, because as we were collecting the material, there was this kind of call and response that we were seeing. You'd have someone singing something in Iraq, and then a few months later it would be sung in Syria, and then it would arrive to Palestine. So of course we were thinking about the echo and the resonance, but also the way in which every time there was a kind of mutation that happens as it moves between times and spaces, but also there is this very kind of profound feeling that you have where, it is your song, but it's not only your song, or it is your wound, but it's not only your wound. So it kind of also creates a community in the absence of a community. And that's how we thought about creating the performances with the performers. So really kind of amplifying the echo and the inscriptions and the way that things mutate. But I think that we also, we were working with a very, the songs that we've collected were very traditional kind of repertoire. And it was important for us to break that as well.
Can I ask about that in a way, like from another angle, which is the text on screen, right? Which is how we receive the kind of lyrics, but the lyrics are mixed in with fragments of poetry, and in a way the authorship is constantly in a way unclear, or the boundary between what might be a song, what might be something you have written, what might be Can you just talk about that kind of that way and specifically doing it graphically, right? That it appears on screen.
Well, I mean, after we finished this process of creating the performances and the filming, we began to write a script, and we began writing that script in January 2020, and it was really, it was very much thinking about what it means to be in a constant state of mourning. And then the pandemic happened, so we actually continued to write the script during the pandemic. So a lot of what you see is this script that we've written, having already done a lot of the filming and the performances, and sometimes it's actually referencing some of the moments. And then within that, there are, certain fragments from the songs that come in, but there's also a lot that hasn't been translated. So there's a lot that if you speak Arabic, you're going to get
another layer,
a whole nother layer that's not actually in the script.
Right.
And then we started to work on the sound in relation to that script. So that's how we usually work with sound. So the sound is kind of done conceptually to the script that we wrote.
Well, one actually thing that just associating away to some of the other works in the show is one thing I really noticed is the decision. I might be wrong, but I don't think there's a single moment in any of the works in the show where a voice and a body are kind of in sync, right? That there's this real sense of like dislocating. So you're never quite sure, and even the music, like sometimes they're not, it's not that things are always out of sync. The screens, sometimes it's the same footage, but it's not quite in sync, or you're not sure, you can't tell because you can't see them at the same time. But also this way in which the voice is never completely immediately attachable to a body, to a subject. Can you say more about this? Because it seems that does seem reflected through all the works, that sense of...
I think, so this is the first time we actually show faces in our works. And this goes back to the idea of, this is, your song, but also the song of others, right? So for the longest time, we've been trying to think about how, this could be, I feel like there's a call in our works, like a call to action, a call to take up the position. And so for the longest times, you always saw the characters with their back turns in all our videos. You would never see their faces. And the first time you see our face was the Avatar work, actually. And
So just we should say for how people haven't seen it, is that they're digital avatars, kind of. There's no. You never appear, but these.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that the idea was for us to, politically speaking, when we first started working, we were really frustrated with the ghettoization of the Palestinian condition, right? This idea that this is a singular issue that is very specific and very particular, that is not related to other conditions. And so we were really insistent on sort of, so the mic go away. Yeah, we were really insisting on this sort of call in the work. So this is specific, but it's also not specific. And this could be you as well, the viewer, and it could be others. And so I think that sort of carried on with our practice in different ways, this idea to sort of, this call in the work, a call to action, a call to take up, this is about you as well, and not just specifically about these characters.
And the disjuncture and the sound.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I haven't really thought about it in that way, in the disjuncture of the sound. It goes back to sort of, embodying, to me, like sort of, embodying other characters or embodying being other, taking up other positions. So this is you and not you at the same time.
I think we have some moments where it is in sync, and those moments are kind of important in this work. Right? Spoke about that a lot, but I think the dissonance is really important in our work. Being in this kind of dissonant position. Where there's always something slightly disrupting what could be like a smooth terrain. So I mean, that's important for us.
Absolutely, because that formal strategy seems also thematically all the way through the show. Like one of the most striking lines in this piece is "We are the negative," right? And this idea of kind of opening up all of the different modalities of the negative. That it isn't the negative. Obviously, is the negative, is the downtrodden, is that? But also that sense of like that which is slipping through the cracks, that which is escaping the identity is being imposed, and that seems to be this ambivalence that's in a lot of the work. That sense of being the negative is both a condition of imposed, and it's also a possibility. It's a pure possibility
it's
of escape.
also us thinking about that it is the constant condition, that we have to live in, and in a way, there are. I think there has been a lot of talk about, repair or politics of repair for many, many years, but there are some conditions where there isn't the possibility of repair right now. So there's something that is broken and keeps getting broken, right? So there's just this continual violence that we are living through and different communities are living through. So we began to really think about what it means to sort of almost sort of embrace the negative space and find in that space a way to be unbound from certain mechanisms of power and oppression, because there's something also very liberating in being able to do that, and being able to almost like subvert the conditions that are imposed upon you, which are meant to be your shackles, right? So how can we think about those sort of impossible, very oppressive conditions as the means through which we break out, we seep out, or we go unseen, and we're in that break, in that crack, where there's an opening, actually, the break creates an opening at the same time as a break. So I think that's very significant for us.
I guess in the work in the all these terrifying frontiers, the Avatar work, that's maybe the most explicit, where you're using this Edward kind of mixing Edward Said quotes with your own texts, and around this idea of kind of fugitive identity, which again it seems to have this double charge, the sense of both being in flight but also escaping, I wonder if we could just talk maybe more formally for a second about this sort of this grammar of interruption through the show, that this way in which, for example, I think it's very striking in all the videos, the way in which we were saying before, when I came yesterday to see the show, I had this sense of frustration. There was a lot of people in the space, and I wanted to get through the crowd to the best space to see the works. And I came today before it was open, and I was here on my own, and I realized that was ludicrous, that actually, if anything, I was the one blocking the beam, right? To get that there is no one place to be. It's constantly promising you and denying you at the same time, and that the screens do that in such a wonderful way. I think in this show, these different kinds of object, which you feel like are blocking your view, but they are the screen. They're what you're supposed to look at. And could you just say more about this? This formal way of playing with the idea of interruption in across the show, because that does seem like one of the threads that connects the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think we think a lot about how, there isn't this sort of complete image or this sort of smooth surface that you sort of see everything, right? That you, what you think you're seeing is not necessarily always what is actually happening. And I think this comes from, our experience of dispossession, experience of being in Palestine. Living in Palestine, you are kind of, there's checkpoints and there's walls, and you can literally reach the dead end. You can drive and just find a wall in front of you, and you have to turn back. There's no
line of vision.
Your literal line of vision could be severed. And I think earlier on, we really it's important to say that actually our first works were actually just sound, because we were we thought about, how do we make the familiar strange again? And sound is porous. It can, go through walls. It has another power. The horizon is, it's impossible to sort of sever the horizon of sound, but it is very possible to sever the horizon of the image. And we live that daily in Palestine, the bodily, physical experience of being there, whether you're crossing a checkpoint or just even driving around. So I think that really informed our sort of thinking. There's literal walls. So so I think that's the kind of line of thinking that brought us to that, but also, the further fragmentation, the constant fragmentation of things, and the perspective of where you're standing and how that sort of your movement and your imbrication, the viewer and the body's imbrication is constantly there. You can't escape that. You step 2 steps ahead, and your shadow literally appears in the projection, and so you're always aware of your body in the space, and that's almost like a bodily experience that we wanted to maintain throughout our works.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that this, it started with the line of vision being severed, quite literally. It's pretty insane. But again, it's another instance where we use that to also push back against the flatness of representation and images from Palestine, and then to open it to a multiplicity, to actually use these structures to sort of think about the kind of multiplicity of time and place that goes into any given moment, and to kind of refuse a very clear, singular narrative that can be very violent, because it reduces your experience and your condition to just that, and it's often not written by you. So in a way, then even though we have to live through the condition of fracture, we use the fracture as a kind of way for us to subvert a lot of the violence of representation and to bring in kind of this, fluidity, there's something that's constantly mutating, which is very important for us as a way of resisting certain
Absolutely.
capture.
No, and this capacity for resistance is so important to the show. But I mean, in terms of the embodied aspect, that it also felt. I started to have this association of, the work, the show is full of moments, for example, of screen capture, right, where we're shown not just an image, but it's framed by, in a way, your laptop screen, and sometimes these screens also feel a bit like open browser tabs or that feeling, which has a certain uncanny feeling, I think, that especially in this space, right, which is in a way such a monumental space, but in a way the associations of seeing very tabbed images, or you're half watching a Netflix film, but you've got another it's a very small scale, very private feeling. So there's something quite uncanny, I think, about that scaling up and being made to think precisely about the kind of simultaneity of different representations that you might have of, for example, of Palestine, but also the context in which you're consuming it in this distracted environment, often deliberately distracting, right? This news feed in which the story is always moving on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I would add this like this idea of liveness. There's something that is not sort of finished, something that doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. And we actually started working together in a live performance setting before we did installations. And so we really wanted to maintain this liveness in our practice and in our installation where, something is not, it's like open-ended. It's open to interpretation. It has its own life. It doesn't have, and I think a lot of the tabs in the sort of computer screen is like literally us sort of screen recording, putting images together and recording our screens, and sort of when you have live improvisation, a lot of things emerge through that. Like our process, even of like editing, is like we literally sit in the studio and jam as if we're like a band, like jamming on sound and image and projections and recording hours of us jamming, and then that's how like new things emerge and new ideas emerge, and the desktop was a big part of that. And so I think throughout our practice, like this sort of open-endedness, the process, the idea that the work has a life of its own is something that we like on purpose try to like maintain through the work.
Can I ask about that actually in terms of some of the different media you work with? Because again, we're not going to be able to touch on all the works in the show. So, but I thought it would be nice to mention one of the works which doesn't have moving image, and yet My Mask is Powerful, Part 2.
Yeah. Part 1 has moving image.
Part 1 has moving image, but that's not here, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but maybe I can just read the list of materials, because I think that in itself is quite kind of eloquent. The installation consists of 3D printed replicas of Neolithic masks from the West Bank and the surrounding areas, corkboards, documents, images, drawings, books, tools, cardboard boxes, wooden pallets, concrete bricks, dried plants from sites of destroyed villages, branches and logs, burnt wood, rocks, house remains, broken ceramics, and mini projectors. It's almost like a prose poem in a way, the description list. But I was really wondering in that that's a work which how fixed is the form? So that sense, it has this kind of corkboard, pinboard feeling of like showing a process of research and discovering things. But is it something that you would change every time you show it, or how fixed are these elements of the work and the way they relate to one another?
I mean, it's not very fixed. I mean, the work really adapts to the space and to the site. I mean, this work, for example, is much larger than what we're showing here. So this is, a very specific variation of the work. So we have a fantasy that the work never ends. Like each project, of course, it gets collected, and then you kind of have to seal it.
It gets killed.
In a certain way, But our desire is to keep sort of reinscribing the works, with the hope that they stay alive somehow, that they don't become sort of fossilized in that specific moment that we made them in. I mean, of course, there is so many things from that moment, but we constantly change. So there's actually new images that were never shown before this time in the work, and the plants and the materials are pretty much different every time we show it, because there's a whole process of collecting the plants again, and it depends what we come across and what we collect. So I think, it's important for us to be able to constantly sort of re-inscribe the work or keep it feeling like it's alive somehow. Yeah.
I mean, it's a nightmare for any conservation, obviously, but it is what it is.
It's a very complex work to unpack here in a short space of time. But I wonder if we could just. It seems like one of the things that it's not mentioned in the text, but it is mentioned in the text in one of the notebooks in the show, is that part of the impetus, it seems, is these masks, these Neolithic masks, like Stone Age masks from the West Bank, being shown in an Israeli museum, and in a way, part of. So this becomes almost like a kind of shadow or counter museum in which you have these replicas that you've made of these masks. Can you just talk about that idea? Like, why did that become an impetus for you to make a response or a kind of why were these Neolithic masks?
That project started with a poem by Adrienne Rich that she wrote in the 70s called "Diving into the Wreck." And we were reading it in 2016, and in it she describes this dive into the wreckage, and she talks about the wreckage as a site of potential. And it was at a time where, much of the Middle East was a site of wreckage, and it was like the poem was like an opening for us to think about. And I think that work started a whole cycle of works, basically, but it was an opening for us to say, okay, how can we think of the site of the wreckage as a site of potential? And in it, she talks about this because she's literally scuba diving. So she has a stanza where she says, first the air is blue, and then it's green, and then it's black, and I am blacking out, and yet my mask is powerful. It pumps my blood with power. And what that made us think about is, how can you breathe in conditions where you're not supposed to be able to breathe? How can you be in conditions in which you're not meant to even survive those conditions? So this idea of being able to breathe where you cannot breathe really started to be a very important one for us in that moment. And so then we were, starting to think about masks in relation to Palestine, and we thought we were just going to come across the ski masks. And when we did the search, we came across these crazy Neolithic masks that are 9,000 years old, oldest known masks to date, and mostly been looted from the West Bank. Actually, one of the masks was an amulet that the community was still using until the late 19th century, before a Polish priest supposedly bought it. But he was chased, in his own testimony, he was chased by the villagers because this was an amulet for them. And so for us, it goes beyond just the show at the Israel Museum. It's what happens to looted material culture when it just goes into a museum, whereas it could have been part of a living material culture that actually is alive. It's not about some object just in a vitrine, right? And so it was important for us to try to, we used we couldn't go to the museum, so we used the 3D exhibition walkthrough that they had to basically take screenshots of the masks and reproduce them. Well, and freedom. Yeah. Freedom as something that we can think about using now, and actually. Just now, this year, we're going to do a whole website for this project and put all the 3D renders up. And
you can print your own masks.
We're talking to a bunch of different groups who are going to be using the masks in different alternative tours and things, and just opening it up to other also inscriptions and mythologies. So, it's also connected to how we think about archives. So everything we collected for this project, we put back up online. We translated this one down here. We translated 70 of the songs, which was a lot of work, actually. But it's about trying to free free these living archives, what we see as living archives that people can still use, and we can think about using them now, and think about it as part of a kind of live, living material culture. And so we created this whole counter mythology. So actually now when you search for Neolithic masks in Palestine, you get this project and you get the whole mythology that we created around going to these sites of destroyed villages and wearing the masks, and which we actually did. And that was very inspired by young people that were going to the sites of destroyed villages, and not us, nothing to do with us, but they were going there and they were, camping out, they were having parties there and really kind of insisting on these sites as places that people can return to and that are alive. So there became this sort of connection between the masks not being just a fossilized object and being something that's living, and also the sites of the destroyed villages as being something that could be alive again. And then the vegetation is part of how the site lives.
Right.
It lives in the living archive of the vegetation that's in those places as well.
Yeah, and the thistle, in a way, is almost like the spirit plant, the spirit animal of the show, in a way, right? That this idea. Can you say more about that? About this plant in particular as being taking on this charge for you?
Yeah, the Syrian thistle, which is very much present in the show, and almost all of them, is essentially from that work when we were doing this visits to the destroyed villages. We were just taking those, we were taking those trips. We were taking the trips with people who had never been to the sites. And that was an important element. We weren't there to sort of document the site, but we were there to sort of actually take these trips. And sort of, in the end, when we were filming, we were trying to capture that sort of almost visceral experience of going to the sites rather than documenting it. So you don't, in the video part, you don't actually see ruins or anything, but you just see people going through, looking at plants, looking at things. And I think for us it was part of the project itself, or part of this when we went, a lot of these villages you actually couldn't find. And so the plants became a way that we could locate the villages. So sometimes you would follow a certain plant and that would lead us to the village. So it was amazing. You follow the path and then you're like, oh, we're standing on top of the ruins. And we just found the houses under us, for example. Because you have these apps that are made for the destroyed villages, but they're not exactly precise. So you would go to the general location, but then you really can't find the villages. So the thistles and the plants became markers, because also villages, things like cactus, for example, were used as actual barricades for Palestinian villages. So, and then a lot of what the settlers did was they planted foreign plants. So they brought pine trees from Switzerland to make the desert bloom, but also to hide the villages so that we can't recognize them anymore. And yet the plants resisted, and that's how we were able to locate them. So
these thistle boundaries, in a way, a kind of natural form of resistance to that erasure.
And we weren't going expecting that, but they became such a very important element, because the plants themselves were resisting. Every spring they come back. Another thing they used to plant is eucalyptus, because eucalyptus actually kills all the other plants around it. It sucks up the nutrients. And yet cactus and all these resilient plants were fighting back, essentially. So they became very important elements in almost all our works past that project. And specifically the thistle, which is the Syrian thistle, the purple one, is it grows where the soil has been disturbed. And it also, when it decomposes, it gives nutrients back to the soil that brings back the original plant that used to be there. And so it became a really an important sort of thing to think about, this sort of unwanted thing that gives that is able to sort of give life. So it became a very, and that's where the color purple came as well into the work. And
But the unwanted, it's thinking through, unwanted bodies, unwanted communities, and the thistle becomes a way to think about that. And it's also very beautiful at the same time, and very resilient
and prickly.
And prickly. Yeah.
I'm aware of time, and I want to open it out in a second. Maybe I can ask you one more thing, a bit idiosyncratically, but just about, you mentioned Adrian Rich kind of lent you the title of one of the works, the poet Adrian Rich. And I was really thinking, going through the show today, that I think often when we talk about exhibitions as being poetic, it's because we don't know what else to say. It's a kind of, especially when critics say it. But this seems to be a show in which the relationship's really to poetry, not to the poetic in general. Like the work is full of poems, actually, and there's actually a kind of quite poem-like logic to the structuring of the work.
That's true, yeah.
Maybe, I was thinking, I took a photo, maybe I could read one of the short pieces from up here, if that's okay. So this is from the piece that's directly above us, which is called Where the Soil Has Been Disturbed. Thank you. And it's a text that's kind of unobtrusively pinned to one of the objects. Shall I read it, or do you want to read it?
No, you go ahead. Yeah,
okay.
No, go ahead. Interested how you're going to read.
Yeah, me too. I say we, and yet oceans divide us, or .rtf is because it's a rich text file. 4 a.m. We are under siege. I say we, and yet oceans divide us. If you don't leave, they will demolish the house on top of your heads. We lose contact. I say we and mean so many named and unnamed that share in a wound that is theirs and not theirs. Later, after it is all rubble, I watch you. When I say watch, I mean on a screen thousands of kilometers away, trying to retrieve forms of life from the debris. What is undone can be done, and what is done can be undone. You come out holding what remains of a fridge. This is all I was able to get from under the rubble. This is what remains, a fridge with family memories on it. We are trying to string words together, but there is no language, only sounds that tremble through us. I think it's very beautiful. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, poetry, there's so many things. I for one, come from a family of poets, and I used to be a poet. Now it kind of just goes into the work, really. So poetry, the oral tradition is a very big part of the Arabic tradition, which is a very oral and culture, really. And poetry was a very important way that people bore witness. Is a very important form of testimony, actually. And it was also a very live thing because people would improvise, these poetic stanzas, and they would travel, and then they would enter into song. So also Arabic music, song is very connected to poetry, actually. A lot of our works, either start with, poetry that we've written or other people's poetry. But I think also what's important about poetry is that it undoes language, in a way. It undoes language in a way where we can imagine different possibilities, which is what we're trying to do. It breaks language and recreates it anew.
So, for example, like this idea we were talking about earlier of that the subject position changes. It's not when you read a poem, you expect breaks and gaps and intervals and gaps on the page, and you don't. It doesn't. You take it. You don't question it.
Yeah. So
and that seems, even in the work that's non-linguistic here, it has something of that quality of trying to kind of recreate that logic of poetry, of bringing us into that contract.
And it was interesting that you said that the works feel structured. We quite literally start with the text. All our works start with text, and then the sound. If there's sound, it's created in relation to the text, and then the image comes in later, and then there's this constant back and forth. But text is really the starting point.
Even before we go filming, a lot of the times we have a lot of the sound done, because the sound will then inform rhythm and color and all kinds of things. Which is not a usual way to work. Usually the sound is done to an image or to a video, but we really insist on like working on sound and text independently together for the sound to have its own conceptual sort of framework on its own.
Yeah.
Yeah, which kind of gives you this multiplicity again of entry points to the work. Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, there's loads more I'd love to ask you, but I'm going to stop hogging the spotlight that we find ourselves in. We have a
Very
road.
strong spotlight,
It is.
I must say.
We feel very exposed, so we would like you to expose yourselves. We would like. There's a roving mic, I think, and if over here. So if you've got a question or a comment, yes, we have one right here.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask you if you could talk more about. There's an excess of Arabic compared to the English, so it's more this the body, the Arabic body appears in this excess of language, and I'm very thankful that this exists for us. The invention of the concept of negativity that you are doing with na'is, the word, which doesn't mean only negativity.
No, of course.
I mean, yeah, you know, I'm not going to say it. So could you please talk a bit? Can you say something about this, because it is a solution, like a poetical and political solution that I have never heard before.
Yeah.
And I'm very thankful that you did that. It's very graceful and very efficient.
Oh, thank you.
Can you please say a few more words
About this concept of biennials?
How did you come to using it that way, not just as a, complaining?
Yeah, complaining, biennials.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
We actually have a label called biennials now as well. I think it was really. It started from this place of, thinking about, what does it mean to be in a constant state of mourning or in a constant state of lack, or to be in something that is broken, that does not get repaired, right? So because we heard so much about, post-colonial conditions of repair, but a lot of people are not living in conditions where repair is possible. And then, we started to think about very much, what does it mean to stay in the lack? What does it mean to stay in the thing that is broken, to remain in the thing that is broken? And then from that, try to find a different language, or try to find, an opening out, rather than trying to make whole, when sometimes it's not possible to make whole. And from that, and also, you're constantly, you feel like you're in the lack, right? You feel like you're constantly biennials in so many different ways, It's like your existence, and that you're thrown into this negative space the whole time. And it was a way for us to also try to sort of empower ourselves by, taking up that space. So what does it mean to be the negative then? And then from being in the negative, trying to become sort of unbound and undoing certain structures, because actually you're outside. You're in this space that's outside, that's not accepted anyway. So that can actually be a very powerful space. It can be a very important disruptive space to an order of things that's very, very wrong across the world. So kind of embracing those possibilities and trying to think about how we can use the conditions that are imposed on us to try to even momentarily liberate ourselves. So really kind of embracing being in the negative and thinking about what that means. And then we really created the performances with that whole concept of mind, of being in the break, lingering in the break, remaining in the thing. And so the performances, many of them are based on these, fragments, but then through the breaks, you enter really kind of you transcend. There's something that you're able to transcend the conditions that you're in through remaining in the break. So that was a very important process for us in the performances themselves, where something you're able to even in a moment transcend the conditions that try to keep you bound, you know? So, yeah. You're welcome. Thank you for the questions. Very nice.
Are there some other questions or comments out in the dark on the uncomfortable chairs?
Comfortable chairs.
Thank you for your presentations. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the relationship between what you were talking about early on, about the importance of life in your work and its relationship to the moving image, because historically, of course, the moving image and film, when it was, if not invented, but originated, has always been seen to capture life, and in particular, sort of the different rhythms of life, so to speak, and in its chemical version, 24 frames per second and so on. And as Mike was bringing in this, what you also worked with some called desktop cinema, kind of with the, desktop windows and so on included in your work, and these different sort of moments in moving image history and their different rhythms and relationship to life.
I mean, that's a very
There's
good
so much
question.
to say.
I'm going to try to find one way of answering that. One way of thinking about that is, I'm very drawn to how just ordinary people are using moving image now. If we go back to the archive that we began collecting for this project, it was incredibly moving for us to, in a way, see what I would say the call of like third cinema, right? The third cinema had this call that, would be cinema for all, and everyone would make all, and in a way, despite all the censorship and surveillance that we see online, there are still, it's in a way that call is being answered by, ordinary people in sort of extreme conditions, using the moving image now as a call out to communities and people that they cannot reach, and then people are answering that call. So it was really incredible for us how, there'd be a song that we would have 50 variations of that would have been, across spaces and times of people re-performing it and adding new inscriptions into it. So that's a real vitality, right? That's an affirmation of life, and also people who believe in the power of moving sound and image and the way that it can travel where your body cannot go. A lot of these people are in impossible conditions where they're told it's not safe for them to be where they are, and they're told that they're illegal in so many places, which is the most absurd thing that you could ever think. And yet they, through the moving image and these quite literally like traveling images on the internet and sounds, they break. So I'm always really inspired by people's practices, and then I think that's what keeps that sense of vitality for us in the moving image and the significance of what it can still do. Yeah.
At the same time, I just wanted to make the connection in a way, like we haven't spoken about it, but I think maybe it's my favorite work in the show, this piece called "A Rising Star Testifying."
Yeah.
This very beautiful, very complex installation, but at the center of it is a piece of surveillance footage of a Palestinian who is murdered for foraging a koob, for this herb, which again touches, if anyone saw Jumana Mana's recent film, thematically is very close. But it's interesting that, that's the surveillance footage is, we often associate, right, the idea of photographic imagery as being a way of preserving, of saving, but clearly the surveillance footage is the instrument of his death. It's right. It's not just that it's preserved his image. It's also the way in which it's the form of surveillance. So there's a kind of, again, it's kind of doubly charged. There's also this sort of deathly quality that these operative images, as Harren Frocke would say, have, right? These forms of surveillance images which are instruments of death rather than of preservation.
Well, I mean, something I keep thinking about from his question and to her was this idea of insisting that the space is alive, not dead and not relegated to dead time. And I think that the trips we took to the villages, I remember that once we made it's not showing here, but the video and sound work we made for the mask work. I remember someone who's from an older generation was sort of saw the video and was a little bit disturbed because they were like, these sites are sites of destruction, and yet you're making it seem like we're not mourning the site. And I feel that us sort of through the videos and like through making the work and through moving through the spaces and how we filmed it, we're insisting on the liveness of the space, and obviously like another thing I'm thinking about is we're always filming. We never have a tripod, for example, with us when we're filming, and we do our own filming. So me and Ruanne are mostly doing the filming, and the reason why we don't have a tripod is because we're usually filming in areas we're not supposed to be in, and so we need to be a very small crew. And we need to be able to move very quickly if the settlers come, if the soldiers come. And so that really, and that's not really something we sort of feature in the work or say in the work, but it's really it's an embodied filming, an embodied kind of filming where we are present there in the space and insisting on returning to these sites until we can't anymore, because many of the sites we go to, we come back the year after and we can't access the site anymore because it's been fenced off and there's an army barricade and, because the land is constantly being taken away from you. And so within our practice is this like going out to the sites, going out to these spaces and insisting on living in these spaces and activating them. And that sort of really informs the language that we create in the filming, in the videos. So the camera's always moving, the camera's always, we don't go with a large production team at all. Sometimes we pretend that we're on a picnic, so we'll take our family with us, and we say, you picnic here, and we're going to be filming here, and there's a kind of like a decoy sort of, to sort of,
It's true. It's true.
It's pretty intense.
We've been in some dangerous...
We've been in some very dangerous situations before, just from filming.
I think there is time for one more question, if there is one.
Anyone?
No?
Thank you so much. Just got curious about that last comment and kind of maybe continuing on it. So it's not really a clearly formulated question, but just thinking about this thing of the image and the act of filming, not only as surveillance or as a preservation or an archive, but also this action that can be dangerous and that can put you as the person with the camera in danger, or also be, I guess, a device for opening up for the possibility for justice. Mm-hmm. So I guess I was just kind of thinking about that dimension and whether you also would like to say something kind of along those lines.
I mean, for us, like, it's almost like the filming is the after effect, So for us, like for this project, it was really important that we do these performances outdoors because it's about claiming space and being in space. So much of the archive that we've collected is about people holding on to their community, holding on to space that's literally disappearing. And so all the locations that we chose are actually locations that are under threat of settlers taking them over. And it was about us being in those spaces together and creating those performances in this space. And so the filming is the after effect, and it's very embodied. It's basically us with one other person, filming in a situation, like he said, where we can't put a tripod down. We can't sit and plan out or do a crane, and we can't do any of that because it's the first thing is that we want to be in this space, and we want to activate this space, and we want to insist on our right to be there, and we want to create something very beautiful there together. And then the filming is and that's the case with with all of our projects. We're talking about a disappearing landscape. We're talking about places that have already been destroyed. And we're talking about how we can return to these sites, how we can activate them. And that's the way in which there's also a call in the work. And, with this work, the performers had never been to these places before. And it was very empowering for them as well, because they were also scared to go to some of the places. They were worried. They were, and getting to know the land, getting to know the landscape, getting to know communities. We spent a long time going out to the sites first, meeting people there, seeing who could come with us to try to keep it as safe as possible. And that's a big part of the work that you don't see, but it's a big part of what we're doing in terms of building a community in Palestine. So that's a very big part of the work for us. Yeah.
Great. I think we have to end it there. We should just say though that apart from obviously seeing the show, people should come back on the 26th and 27th. So the performance is going to happen here, right? And it's kind of an expansion of this piece, as I understand it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're
doing a performance, and then
live video
two
and
of the characters in the video are also coming to do their own performance.
Their own performance, yeah. Which is,
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, we look forward.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you for
very much
coming.
Thank you for coming.